I have a couple different types of working dogs here on the ranch. We have livestock guardian dogs and herding dogs. I've been working with dogs since I was a teenager, actually. I've done a lot of behavioral dog training.
When Texas announced it was spending millions of taxpayer dollars on a puppy program, people laughed and called it a joke because these weren't rescue dogs or service animals, but oversized puppies meant to protect livestock. Critics said it would fail. Experts dismissed it, and social media had a field day mocking million-dollar mutts. Then the numbers started coming in. Predator attacks slowed, lamb survival surged, and ranches that were supposed to collapse began turning profits. The laughter stopped, the critics went quiet, and the program everyone ridiculed became something no one could ignore. When predators stopped hunting and started destroying livelihoods. Texas did not collapse all at once. There was no single year ranchers could point to and say that was when everything went wrong. Instead, the damage crept in quietly, season by season, loss by loss, until the numbers stopped making sense and the margins disappeared entirely. At first, the losses were easy to rationalize. A few missing lambs were blamed on bad luck. Coyotes had always existed, predators had always been part of ranching life, and every operation expected to lose a small percentage of animals each year. For generations, that loss had been manageable. But by the early 2000s, something had shifted. Coyote populations across Texas were exploding, and as urban expansion fragmented habitats and prey sources changed, the animals adapted faster than anyone anticipated. They became bolder, more efficient, and more willing to hunt close to human activity. What had once been occasional livestock losses turned into routine devastation. Ranchers began waking up to scenes that felt less like nature and more like organized destruction. Newborn lambs were torn apart before dawn. Pregnant ewes were killed days before giving birth. Entire flocks were scattered overnight, carcasses strewn across pastures in ways that suggested excess rather than necessity. Coyotes were no longer just hunting to survive. They were exploiting vulnerability. Sheep and goats, especially during birthing seasons, are defenseless. Lambing often happens at night when mothers are exhausted and newborns can barely stand. Once coyotes learned which pastures offered easy prey, they returned again and again. These ranches became predictable food sources, and the pressure never stopped. This wasn't hunting anymore, it was sustained predation. For ranchers, the losses multiplied in ways that were devastating but invisible to outsiders. A lamb wasn't just an animal. It represented months of feed, veterinary care, labor, and breeding investment. Losing a pregnant ewe meant losing years of genetic selection and future production. Each takedown echoed forward through the balance sheet. And as losses mounted, the math turned brutal. Across Texas, sheep and goat producers began bleeding money at an alarming rate. Estimates showed that 10 to 20% of lamb crops were being lost every year statewide, with some regions suffering far worse. These weren't abstract figures. They showed up as unpaid loans, shrinking herds, sleepless nights, and families making calculations no one wants to make about whether they can afford to keep going. Coyotes didn't take seasons off. While markets fluctuated and weather patterns shifted, the predators remained constant, relentless, adaptive, and patient. For families who had worked the same land for generations, the question slowly changed. It stopped being how to fix the problem and became how long they could survive it. Nowhere did this reality become clearer than at the Carl and Bina Sue Martin Research Ranch in Menard County, Texas. By 2009, the ranch wasn't just struggling. It was unraveling. That year, they managed to wean only 20% of their lamb crop. Out of every 10 lambs born, 8 were lost to predators before they could ever contribute to the operation. 80% gone, not to drought, disease, or mismanagement, but to coyotes. This wasn't a single bad season. It was the culmination of years of escalating pressure. The ranch had done everything industry standards demanded. Animals were monitored. Feed was managed. Predator control methods were deployed aggressively. None of it mattered. Coyotes learned helicopter patterns, avoided traps, skirted snares, and adapted faster than ranchers could respond. When one predator was removed, another filled the gap almost immediately. Costs rose while effectiveness collapsed. And the Martin Ranch was not alone. Across Texas, ranchers threw everything they had at the problem. Helicopter gunners were hired at enormous expense. Thousands of dollars were poured into traps, fuel, equipment, and labor. Some ranchers tried guard llamas, hoping size alone would intimidate predators. Others doubled down on lethal control, convinced that more effort would eventually tip the balance. It never did. Coyotes adapted, returned, and learned. Every temporary success was followed by renewed losses, and as regulations tightened and public opposition to lethal predator control grew, ranchers found themselves losing both their livestock and the tools they had relied on for decades. The economics became unforgiving. Fewer lambs meant less wool, less meat, higher costs per surviving animal, and rising consumer prices. Profit margins vanished. Operations that had survived droughts, recessions, and generational transitions now faced extinction from a predator that weighed less than 50 pounds. Some ranchers sold off their flocks to pay debts. Others sold land. Many simply walked away, closing family operations that had existed for generations. By the time Texas A&M AgriLife entered the conversation, the sheep and goat industry was no longer asking for innovation. It was asking for a lifeline. What Texas A&M proposed next, however, sounded so absurd that almost nobody took it seriously. And that was when the ridicule began. $1 million puppies and a statewide eye roll. When Texas A&M AgriLife finally announced its proposed solution in 2017, the response was immediate and unforgiving. The idea sounded almost offensive in its simplicity. Livestock guardian dogs. Not new technology, not chemical deterrents, not drones or sensors or weapons, just dogs. To critics, it felt like a punchline waiting to be delivered. And once the phrase government-funded puppy program took hold, the ridicule spread faster than any clarification could stop it. Social media erupted with memes of fluffy white dogs lounging in pastures while coyotes supposedly laughed in the background. Commentators framed the program as an expensive pet adoption scheme funded by taxpayers. Local news stations ran skeptical segments questioning whether this was really the best investment Texas could make at a time when ranchers were losing millions. Financial analysts broke down the numbers bluntly, pointing out that a properly trained livestock guardian dog could cost over $1,000 in its first year and about $500 annually after that. Multiply those costs across hundreds of ranches, and suddenly the program looked like a multi-million-dollar gamble on animals many dismissed as glorified farm pets. Even among ranchers, the doubt ran deep. These were not people unfamiliar with predators. They had spent decades dealing with coyotes using methods they trusted: traps, snares, rifles, helicopter hunts. They had watched predators adapt in real time, learning to avoid danger and return the moment pressure eased. The idea that a single dog, or even a handful of dogs, could protect hundreds of sheep spread across thousands of acres felt absurd. How could a fluffy Great Pyrenees succeed where helicopters, professional trappers, and generations of experience had failed? There was pride involved too. Ranchers are practical, and many bristled at the idea that academics were offering a solution to a problem they had lived with their entire lives. If this worked so well, they wondered, why hadn't it already solved the problem decades ago? Some remembered earlier failures with guard animals that wandered off or chased livestock instead of protecting it. Others worried about roaming dogs, conflicts with neighbors, or liability issues. Most simply couldn't afford another experiment that might fail. To them, this wasn't innovation. It was risk stacked on top of loss. Then Texas A&M made the situation worse, at least in the eyes of critics. They didn't announce a small pilot program. They announced a full-scale research initiative based in San Angelo, complete with specialists, facilities, and multi-year studies. They talked about GPS tracking collars, camera traps, behavioral analysis, and structured bonding protocols. Instead of reassuring skeptics, it reinforced the belief that this was an over-engineered academic project disconnected from the realities of ranch life. The bonding process sounded especially absurd to outsiders. Puppies had to be raised with livestock starting at just 4 weeks old. They couldn't be family pets. They couldn't be treated like normal dogs. Their entire social identity had to be shaped around sheep and goats during a narrow developmental window that would never come again. Training could take up to 2 years before a dog became fully effective. To critics, this sounded slow, expensive, and impractical, especially for ranchers already on the brink of financial collapse. Neighboring states watched with amusement. Industry conferences featured jokes about Texas throwing money at puppy problems. Even within agricultural circles, many believed Texas A&M had lost touch with reality. Why invest millions into dogs when traditional predator control, flawed as it was, at least felt familiar? Inside Texas A&M, however, the tone was very different. Researchers like Reed Redden and his team weren't guessing or improvising. They were building their program on something most people had forgotten. Livestock guardian dogs were not new. They were ancient. For thousands of years, shepherds across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East had relied on breeds like the Great Pyrenees, Anatolian Shepherd, Maremma, and Akbash to protect flocks without constant human supervision. These dogs weren't herders, and they weren't hunters. They were living barriers, bred to stay with livestock, mark territory, and convince predators that the risk wasn't worth the reward. The researchers understood something critics didn't. Predator control in Texas had failed not because ranchers were incompetent, but because coyotes were being treated as targets instead of decision-makers. Eliminate one, another takes its place. Remove pressure temporarily, and losses return. Guardian dogs didn't need to eliminate predators. They only needed to change predator behavior, to make a pasture feel dangerous enough that coyotes would choose easier prey elsewhere. That was the gamble. But data doesn't matter if no one is willing to try the program, and at this point, almost no one was. So Texas A&M made a decision that would define the future of the entire project. They chose the one ranch where failure would be impossible to ignore, a place already on the edge of collapse, where the numbers were so bad that improvement, or failure, would be undeniable. That ranch was the Carl and Bina Sue Martin Research Ranch, and that decision would change everything. When the joke stopped being funny. At first, the dogs themselves didn't look like heroes. They weren't snarling attack animals or elite, military-style predators, but awkward, oversized puppies with clumsy paws and soft expressions, wandering among sheep, as if they didn't yet understand the weight of what was being asked of them. To critics, this only reinforced the joke. These were the million-dollar solution everyone was supposed to take seriously. But something subtle was already changing, even if no one wanted to admit it. Ranchers began noticing that coyotes were behaving differently. They weren't disappearing completely, but they were hesitating. Camera traps caught them pacing fence lines, circling at a distance, stopping just short of flocks they once raided without fear. Losses didn't vanish overnight, but the pattern shifted. Predation was no longer constant. It became sporadic, unpredictable, cautious. And to anyone who understood predator behavior, that hesitation was everything. By the time the dogs reached full maturity, the effect became impossible to ignore. These guardian dogs didn't wander aimlessly across the land. They claimed it. They moved with purpose, patrolling boundaries night after night, marking territory, memorizing lambing grounds, and learning exactly where the flock was most vulnerable. Coyotes that tested those boundaries were met with deep, thunderous barking that rolled across the pastures, a sound that carried farther and longer than fences ever could. And here was the part that shocked even wildlife biologists. The coyotes listened. Predators didn't need to be killed to be defeated. They only needed to be convinced that this pasture wasn't worth the risk. As lambing seasons passed, survival rates climbed steadily. What once felt like luck started to look like a pattern. Ranchers who braced themselves for the usual losses didn't find carcasses in the morning. Nights that used to be filled with anxiety became quiet. For the first time in years, flocks slept without constant pressure. The transformation wasn't just biological, it was psychological. Ranchers who had spent decades fighting a losing war suddenly felt back in control. Stress levels dropped. Labor demands eased. Helicopter hunts were canceled. Traps were left unused. Instead of reacting to devastation, producers began planning for growth again, and the numbers told the story better than any press release ever could. Operations that once hovered on the brink of collapse were now turning consistent profits. Lamb crops exceeded expectations. Breeding programs stabilized. Families that had quietly discussed selling land stopped having those conversations altogether. The same program that had been mocked as government waste was now accomplishing what years of lethal control never managed: sustainable protection. When industry economists revisited their early predictions, they were forced to reverse course. The return on investment wasn't marginal. It was overwhelming. One properly trained dog was outperforming helicopters, traps, and guns combined, without regulatory backlash, without public outrage, and without wiping out wildlife populations. And suddenly, the laughter stopped. The jokes disappeared. The memes faded. They were replaced by phone calls, emails, and waiting lists. Ranchers who once dismissed the idea now wanted in, and they wanted in fast, because Texas hadn't just found a way to protect sheep. It had found a way to outthink predators, regulators, and decades of failed tradition using a solution that had stood beside humans for thousands of years, quietly waiting to be taken seriously again, the one mistake that ruined everything. As demand exploded and Texas A&M's phones began ringing nonstop, the researchers noticed something unsettling. Not every ranch that adopted guardian dogs was seeing the same success. Some producers reported dramatic improvements almost immediately, while others struggled with roaming dogs, injured livestock, or guardians that showed little interest in protecting anything at all. Critics pointed to these failures as proof that the entire program was unreliable, but the truth was far more specific and far more dangerous to the project's future. The difference wasn't the breed, the size of the pasture, or bad luck. It came down to one critical mistake that could quietly destroy the program before a dog ever had a chance to succeed. And that mistake was bonding. Livestock guardian dogs are not trained like conventional working dogs. They don't rely on commands or constant human direction. Their effectiveness depends almost entirely on what happens during a narrow developmental window, early in life. When a puppy's brain permanently decides who its family is, Between 4 and 16 weeks of age, that decision becomes locked in. Miss that window, and no amount of later training can fully undo the damage. This is where many well-meaning ranchers went wrong. Puppies were brought home and treated like pets, allowed to play with children, sleep near the house, and follow people around, with the plan to move them in with livestock later. From a human perspective, it seemed harmless. From the dog's perspective, it changed everything. Instead of bonding to sheep, the puppies bonded to people. Dogs bonded to humans don't sleep among lambs, patrol pasture boundaries, or position themselves between predators and the flock. They follow trucks, wander roads, chase distractions, and when coyotes appear, they are often nowhere near the animals they were meant to protect. In the worst cases, they leave the property entirely, which explains why so many guardian dogs historically died young, shot by neighboring ranchers or killed on highways. Texas realized that if this mistake continued, the program would collapse under its own success, so the rules became stricter. Puppies were placed directly with livestock as early as 4 weeks old. Human interaction was limited and intentional. Feeding stations were installed inside pastures to remove any incentive to return home, and socialization focused on calm exposure rather than emotional attachment. The message to producers was clear and uncomfortable but necessary. These dogs were not pets, and treating them like pets would break them. Once those protocols were followed consistently, the results stabilized almost immediately. Dogs stayed with their flocks, patrol ranges became predictable, roaming behavior dropped sharply, and survival rates increased not only for lambs, but for the dogs themselves. The researchers weren't just saving livestock anymore. They were refining a system that worked reliably across operations of every size. Then an unexpected effect began to emerge. The dogs weren't only protecting individual flocks, they were changing predator behavior across entire landscapes. Coyotes didn't simply avoid guarded sheep. They altered travel routes, shifted hunting grounds, and reduced activity in areas dominated by guardian dogs. Predation pressure dropped even on neighboring land, creating a buffer effect that extended beyond fenced pastures. Texas hadn't just solved a ranching problem, it had uncovered a way to influence ecosystems without killing predators, without triggering public backlash, and without escalating conflict. And once that realization took hold, the conversation stopped being about puppies or wasted money. It became about control, sustainability, and whether one of the oldest human-animal partnerships in history had quietly become one of modern agriculture's most powerful tools. When the solution spread faster than the problem. Once the results stabilized and the failures were traced back to preventable mistakes rather than flawed science, the shift happened quickly. Ranchers talk, and when something works, word travels faster than any press release or extension bulletin ever could. Operations that had once dismissed the idea of guardian dogs as academic nonsense began quietly asking questions, running numbers, and watching their neighbors' pastures more closely. When they saw flocks surviving intact season after season, skepticism gave way to curiosity, and curiosity turned into action. What made the spread unstoppable was that the results weren't isolated. The same patterns repeated across counties, climates, and ranch sizes. Mid-sized operations saw lamb survival jump to near-perfect levels, while larger ranches covering thousands of acres reported dramatic drops in predation pressure without increasing labor or overhead. Ranchers who had relied on trapping, aerial hunting, and night patrols found themselves scaling back those efforts because they were no longer necessary. The dogs weren't replacing ranchers. They were giving them their time back. As adoption increased, researchers noticed another important shift. The presence of guardian dogs didn't just protect livestock, it changed how predators moved across the landscape. Coyotes learned which areas were no longer worth entering and adjusted their routes accordingly, avoiding guarded pastures altogether. This created a spillover effect where even neighboring operations experienced reduced predation, simply because predators were being pushed out of entire regions rather than eliminated one animal at a time. For the first time, predator management was influencing behavior instead of trying to control populations. Other states began paying attention. Ranching communities in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, facing rising predator pressure and tightening restrictions on lethal control, reached out to Texas A&M for guidance. What they saw wasn't a gimmick or a temporary fix, but a framework that could be adapted to different environments. Universities launched their own studies, extension offices began training programs, and guardian dogs started appearing in places where they had been rare or non-existent just a few years ago earlier. The influence didn't stop at state lines. International researchers studying human-wildlife conflict took notice, particularly in regions where predator conservation collided directly with rural livelihoods. In parts of Africa, guardian dog programs were tested to protect livestock from lions and hyenas, reducing retaliatory killings that had devastated predator populations for decades. In Europe, where wolves were returning to landscapes they had vanished from centuries earlier, guardian dogs offered farmers a way to coexist without constant conflict. The same principles held true across continents, proving that the Texas results were not an anomaly, but a rediscovery of something humans once understood instinctively. As guardian dogs spread, so did an unexpected cultural shift. Ranchers who had once viewed predators as enemies to be eradicated began seeing them as forces to be managed. When livelihoods were no longer under constant attack, tolerance increased. Support for extreme predator control declined, not because attitudes changed overnight, but because desperation disappeared. When people stop losing money, fear loses its grip. What started as a ridiculed experiment had become a quiet revolution. The same program that once drew laughter now served as a model for balancing agriculture, economics, and conservation without sacrificing any one of them. Texas hadn't just solved a local crisis. It had exported a solution to a global problem, proving that sometimes progress doesn't come from new technology at all, but from old partnerships applied with modern understanding. The legacy nobody expected. As guardian dogs became standard practice rather than a novelty, the conversation shifted again, this time from survival to sustainability. The immediate crisis that once threatened to wipe out entire sheep and goat operations began to fade, replaced by a longer-term question that mattered just as much. Could this system hold up over decades, not just seasons? The answer, backed by years of data, suggested that it could, and in some ways, it was becoming stronger with time. One of the biggest breakthroughs came from understanding longevity. Early on, many guardian dogs died young, not from predators but from human infrastructure, roaming into roads, neighboring properties, or unfamiliar territory. By refining bonding protocols, improving pasture-based feeding systems, and teaching boundary awareness from an early age, survival rates increased steadily. Dogs lived longer, worked longer, and delivered far greater returns on investment. Each additional year, a dog stayed on the job translated directly into lower costs and higher stability for ranchers. Breeding programs matured alongside the research. It became clear that not every Great Pyrenees or Anatolian Shepherd was suited for guardian work, and that temperament mattered just as much as size or strength. Dogs that showed calm confidence, low prey drive toward livestock, and consistent territorial behavior became the foundation of selective breeding efforts. Over time, Texas developed networks of breeders who understood these traits, producing dogs specifically suited for modern ranching conditions rather than show standards or companionship alone. Education became the engine that kept the system working. Texas A&M's extension programs expanded field days, online training, and real-world demonstrations that allowed producers to see the dogs in action rather than relying on theory. New ranchers entering the industry learned about guardian dogs not as an alternative, but as standard infrastructure, no different from fencing or water systems. For the next generation, the idea of managing flocks without dogs began to feel outdated. The ecological implications continued to surprise researchers. Long-term monitoring showed that guardian dogs focused almost exclusively on canine predators, largely ignoring deer, birds, and other non-threatening wildlife. This selectivity reduced unintended ecological consequences that often followed lethal predator control. In areas where guardian dogs were widely used, predator populations stabilized instead of fluctuating wildly, creating more predictable and manageable ecosystems. Policy followed practice. As data accumulated, guardian dogs began influencing legislation and regulatory decisions. Non-lethal predator management gained credibility, giving lawmakers an option that satisfied both agricultural and conservation interests. Programs once funded as experiments were now defended as essential investments, and the model developed in Texas became a reference point in policy discussions far beyond the state. Perhaps the most lasting legacy was cultural. The program reshaped how people thought about innovation in agriculture. It proved that progress did not always require expensive technology, automation, or chemicals. Sometimes it meant refining an ancient relationship and supporting it with modern science. Ranchers who once mocked the idea became its strongest advocates, and the same public that laughed at million-dollar puppies now saw them as professionals performing a vital job. By the time the program reached maturity, it was clear that Texas hadn't simply saved an industry from collapse. It had changed the rules of predator management, demonstrating that coexistence, when properly structured, could be more effective than conflict. The guardian dogs did more than protect sheep. They restored confidence, preserved livelihoods, and quietly rewrote the future of ranching in a way nobody had expected when the first puppies were placed in pastures and everyone was still laughing. How a laughingstock became the blueprint. By the time the laughter finally disappeared, the story had already written its ending. What began as a desperate response to collapsing lamb crops and runaway predator losses had evolved into one of the most effective agricultural interventions of the modern era. The guardian dogs never needed dramatic battles or viral moments to prove their worth. They did it quietly, night after night, by standing their ground and making certain places no longer worth hunting. Texas learned a lesson that extended far beyond sheep and goats. The crisis was never just about predators. It was about systems that had failed to adapt, about traditions that no longer matched reality, and about how quickly innovation gets dismissed when it doesn't look impressive on paper. The solution worked not because it was new, but because it was old, refined by centuries of human experience and sharpened by modern science. The real breakthrough wasn't the dogs themselves, but the discipline to apply them correctly. When bonding was respected, when management was consistent, and when expectations matched biology rather than convenience, the results became repeatable and reliable. Losses dropped, profits stabilized, and the endless cycle of reactionary predator control gave way to proactive protection. The ripple effects reached far beyond Texas. Ranchers in other states adopted the model. Conservationists found a rare point of agreement with producers. Policymakers gained a tool that reduced conflict instead of inflaming it. Even public perception shifted, as the same people who once mocked the idea began to understand the quiet intelligence behind it. The dogs had become more than guardians. They were symbols of a different way forward. Perhaps the most telling sign of success was how ordinary the practice eventually became. Children growing up on these ranches couldn't imagine managing livestock without guardian dogs, just as previous generations couldn't imagine life without fences or water tanks. What once sounded radical became routine, and what once drew ridicule became infrastructure. In the end, Texas didn't just save an industry, it restored balance. It proved that coexistence wasn't weakness, that non-lethal solutions could outperform force, and that sometimes the smartest way to solve a modern problem is to listen to the past. The million-dollar puppies were never a joke. They were a reminder that progress often arrives quietly, padded with fur, long before anyone realizes history is being made. If this story changed how you think about problem-solving, resilience, or innovation, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still thinks the best ideas always look obvious at first. Because the next breakthrough might already be standing quietly in the field waiting to be taken seriously.